The South Carolina State Lunatic Asylum, 1828 to 1860. Tim?
Thank you, Dr. Brandt. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. In the last 20 years, much has been written regarding the burials of those committed to the state mental asylum. Often, this tends to focus on the postbellum period, specifically as the asylum began to utilize specially purchased cemetery lots at places like Elmwood Cemetery, Sly Street, and Lower. Much of this is due to the fact that these three burial grounds have all been endangered and in some cases irreparably harmed during the last 2 decades. While these studies are instructive and certainly merit further discussion and broader exposure as a tool for future preservation efforts, they do leave a gap in the scholarship. The purpose of this paper will be to investigate the records of the asylum during the formative antebellum years in an attempt to determine where the dead from these years were likely interred. It is my belief that the grounds of the state asylum hold a high likelihood of containing a number of human remains. This is a contingency that must be considered and planned for, no matter how few these burials may be or how unlikely the scenario of accidental disinterment may seem. It is hoped that by presenting the evidence for the possibility of human interment on the grounds, further desecration of previously unknown remains can be mitigated and prevented. As far as I can determine, there is no concrete primary source material which indicates the presence of burials on the grounds. Much of my research has led me to believe that from at least 1832 up until the point that the state purchases their first plot of land in Elmwood Cemetery, deceased patients from the asylum were either released to family or friends for burial in a private setting. A number of these were at First Presbyterian Church or Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Columbia, or they were hastily buried in the public burial ground of Columbia. Determining the exact location of this burial ground has proved to be problematic. We know that the first public burial ground is actually where Trinity Episcopal sits currently. And the second public burial ground of the city probably stood between, as you can see on the map, between Senate and Pendleton. The South Carolina Railroad Company is no longer there, but between the sale of the first public burial ground in 1808 and 1850, when the so-called Potter's Field, adjacent to Elmwood Cemetery, was designated as the pauper burial area, there are very few records indicating where the indigent poor and those in the custody of the state would have been buried. The likeliest spot, as I said, is indicated on one plat map that you have before you, in the spot where the Vista Commons housing development now stands. This is a contentious assertion, as the area underwent a review process by the SHPO's office and was found unlikely to contain any human remains. Officially, the developer who graded the property pre-building contends that no human remains were discovered during the grading and excavation of the area. This certainly complicates the narrative. I found numerous notations that the deceased of the asylum were interred in a public burial ground in Columbia, starting in June of 1832 and continuing through the 1850s. If the Vista Commons area is not where this burial ground is or was, there are very few other options for those burials. Ultimately, though, this is probably a moot point, as the cemetery, or what's left of it, is covered by housing development. A public burial ground would not have been on the asylum campus during the time period in question, as they already complained of limited space for recreation and a burial area that took in all of the indigent of Columbia, not just asylum patients, would have utilized too much valuable space. What is of more pressing concern to myself, as it should be to the future developer of the Bull Street site, are the deaths which occurred at the asylum previous to the middle of 1832. There are no extant monthly reports covering this time period at the state hospital, and so I have had to rely on the admissions records solely for any information about deceased patients. An incomplete tally indicates that upwards of a half dozen patients died from the time previous to 1832, none of whom have listed places of burial. This alone would not be cause for speculation that they may have been buried within the grounds, were it not for a number of circumstantial oddities regarding these deaths. First, the intake records note only unusual circumstances of burial. These usually include the removal of a body by relatives to some other city. The lack of this notation in the entries regarding early patient deaths indicates that they were buried quickly within the city of Columbia. Second, we can draw inferences from the fact that death was generally thought of in financial terms at the asylum. As mental patients were considered wards of the state, the asylum found themselves financially responsible for interment, and the paper trail of fiscal bureaucracy is instructive. Patients could, of course, come and go unaccounted for in the official records, but money coming in and out of the asylum coffers was noted down to the last penny. To track the earliest burials at Bull Street, or from Bull Street, one must track the payments associated with these deaths and burials. Luckily, the financial records for the site are still in existence and actually predate the first building. While the asylum regents may not have noted the names and circumstances of early patient death, they certainly noted that they were paying one Richard Holmes, no relation to our errand, a local cabinet maker, $5 per coffin for the deceased patients. As more patients died in the custody of the asylum, Holmes seems to have cut the administrators a bulk rate, lowering the price for 2 coffins to $9. Thus, in order to determine the death rate at any given time in the early history of Bull Street, one only has to divide the divide the payments to Holmes by 450. In some cases, there was an additional $5 charge levied for the removal and burial of patients, although this extra charge was invariably incurred by paying patients and passed along to the person paying their bill. In the majority of cases, however, only Holmes's bill for the coffin is noted, which would seem to imply that the state incurred no expense for the actual burial, perhaps because they were burying them on property they already owned. Finally, it would be highly unusual for a mental asylum from this time period to not have at least one burial ground within their grounds. Without exception, every similar asylum of this type and time which has been developed, excavated, or otherwise investigated has yielded burials of some type. Tuscaloosa, Alabama's Bryce Hospital serves as an informative, parallel case study to Bull Street. Although it was built in 1852 on the grounds of the University of Alabama, postdating Bull Street by over 2 decades, Bryce is shockingly visually similar to Columbia's asylum. The story of the burial of their dead is also similar. The dead from Bryce were buried in 4 different areas of the hospital's property during the century and a half while it was functioning. The raw numbers interred on Bryce's campus are still unknown, but estimates run into the thousands, many of these still unmarked and unknown. This is not to say that South Carolina's asylum could not have been anomalous, but the highly circumstantial probability would seem to demand at least some degree of caution and preparedness. To that end, it is my recommendation that at least passing thought be given to a plan for if human remains are encountered during the development process. I certainly hope I am wrong, and that no patients were ever buried within the grounds, but the dangers of assuming this to be true heavily outweigh the small amount of planning which could mitigate the potential desecration of the remains of an already marginalized and forgotten population.